which have hardened in recent years and have combined with rampant disinformation to push too many Americans away from our basic constitutional values. In the spring of 2017, after Trump took office, I wrote an opinion piece in the Arizona Republic highlighting my concerns about the strains on our constitutional boundaries and the shrinking respect for our founding constitutional principles. In the years that followed, my colleagues and I in this body were called upon to participate in 2 separate impeachment trials for crimes against our Constitution. And on January 6th last year, I was standing in this very spot, speaking in this very chamber, defending Arizona's fair and valid election against disinformation when violent insurrectionists halted the presidential certification. Threats to American democracy are real. I share the concerns of civil rights advocates and others I've heard from in recent months about these state laws. I strongly support those efforts to contest these laws in court and to invest significant resources into these states to better organize and stop efforts to restrict access at the ballot box. And I strongly support and will continue to vote for legislative responses to address these state laws, including the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that the Senate is currently considering. I support these bills because they strengthen Americans' access to the ballot box, and they better ensure that Americans' votes are counted fairly. It is through elections that Americans make their voices heard, select their representatives, and guide the future of our countries and our community. These bills help treat the symptoms of the disease, but they do not fully address the disease itself. And while I continue to support these bills, I will not support separate actions that worsen the underlying disease of division infecting our country. The debate over the Senate's 60-vote threshold shines a light on our broader challenges. There's no need for me to restate my long-standing support for the 60-vote threshold to pass legislation. And there's no need for me to restate its role protecting our country from wild reversals in federal policy. It is a view I've held during my years serving in both the U.S. House and the Senate, and it is the view I continue to hold. It is the belief that I have shared many times in public settings and in private settings. Senators of both parties have offered ideas, including some that would earn my support, to make this body more productive, more deliberative, more responsive to Americans' needs, and a place of genuine debate about our country's pressing issues. And while this week's harried discussions about Senate rules are but a poor substitute for what I believe could have and should have been a thoughtful public debate at any time over the past year, such a discussion is still a worthy goal. But a discussion of rules falls short of what is required. American politics are cyclical, and the granting of power in Washington, D.C. is exchanged regularly by the voters from one party to another. This shift of power back and forth means the Senate 60 vote threshold has proved maddening to members of both political parties in recent years, viewed either as a weapon of obstruction or a safety net to save the country from radical policies, depending on whether you serve in the majority or the minority. But what is the legislative filibuster other than a tool that requires new federal policy to be broadly supported by senators representing a broader cross-section of Americans, a guardrail, inevitably viewed as an obstacle by whoever holds the Senate majority, but which in reality ensures that millions of Americans represented by the minority party have a voice in the process. Demands to eliminate this threshold from whichever party holds the fleeting majority amount to a group of people separated on two sides of a canyon, shouting that solution to their colleagues, and that makes the rift both wider and deeper. Consider this. In recent years, nearly every party line response to the problems we face in this body, every partisan action taken to protect a cherished value, has led us to more division, not less. The impact is clear for all to see. The steady escalation of tit for tat, in which each new majority weakens the guardrails of the Senate and excludes input from the other party, furthering resentment and anger amongst this body and our constituents at home. Democrats' increased use of requiring cloture for judicial nominees under President George W. Bush led to similar tactics by Republicans under President Barack Obama. The 2013 decision by Senate Democrats to eliminate the 60-vote threshold for most judicial and presidential nominations led directly to a response in 2017 by Senate Republicans, who eliminated the threshold for Supreme Court nominees. These short-sighted actions by both parties have led to our current American judiciary and Supreme Court, which, as I stand here today, is considering questions regarding fundamental rights Americans have enjoyed for decades. Eliminating the 60-vote threshold on a party line with the thinnest of possible majorities to pass these bills that I support will not guarantee that we prevent demagogues from winning office. Indeed, some who undermine the principles of democracy have already been elected. Rather, eliminating the 60-vote threshold will simply guarantee that we lose a critical tool that we need to safeguard our democracy from threats in the years to come. It is clear that the two parties' strategies are not working, not for either side, and especially not for the country. Now, it's comfortable for members of each party, particularly those who spent their career in party politics, to think that their respective party alone can move the country forward. Party control becomes a goal in and of itself, instead of prioritizing a healthy, appropriate balance in which Americans' diverse views and shared values are represented. But when one party need only negotiate with itself, policy will inextricably be pushed from the middle towards the extremes. And I understand there are some on both sides of the aisle that prefer that outcome, but I do not. And I know that Arizonans do not either. Our country's first president, George Washington, a leader whose wisdom I borrowed at the conclusion of the 2020 impeachment trial, he warned against political factions more than 200 years ago, saying that extreme partisanship could lead to the ruins of public liberty. I was no party man myself, Washington wrote, and the first wish of my heart was, if parties did exist, to reconcile them. Today, we serve in an equally divided Senate, and today marks the longest time in history that the Senate has been equally divided. The House of Representatives is nearly equally divided as well. Our mandate? It seems evident to me. Work together and get stuff done for America. And the past years have shown when a party in control pushes party line changes exceeding their electoral mandate, the bitterness within our politics is exacerbated. Tensions are raised within the country, and traditionally, nonpartisan issues are transformed into partisan wedges. We must address the disease itself, the disease of division, to protect our democracy. And it cannot be achieved by one party alone. It cannot be achieved solely by the federal government. The response requires something greater and, yes, more difficult than what the Senate is discussing today. We need robust, sustained strategies that put aside party labels and focus on our democracy, because these challenges are bigger than party affiliation. We must commit to a long-term approach as serious as the problems we seek to solve. one that prioritizes listening and understanding, one that embraces making progress on shared priorities and finding common ground on issues where we hold differing and diverse views. This work requires all Americans everywhere. Efforts to fix these problems on a bare majority party line will only succeed in exacerbating the root causes that gave way to these state laws in the first place, extending our descent into a more fragmented America. This work is our shared responsibility as Americans. I share the disappointment of many that we've not found more support on the other side of the aisle for legislative responses to state-level voting restrictions. I wish that were not the case. Just as I wish there had been a more serious effort on the part of Democratic Party leaders to sit down with the other party and genuinely discuss how to reforge common ground on these issues. My Republican colleagues have a duty to meet their shared responsibility to protect access to voting and the integrity of our electoral process. We need a sustained, robust effort to defend American democracy, an effort on the part of Democrats, Republicans, independents, and all Americans in communities across this country. So we ask, what must we do to protect our democracy? We should invest heavily in recruiting and supporting state and local candidates for office in both parties who represent the values enshrined in our Constitution. We should ensure we have a judiciary that is less lopsided in its political leanings and that we can all depend on to uphold the Constitution. We must confront and combat the rise of rampant disinformation and ensure that all Americans have the tools to see fact from fiction. This will be particularly difficult work, since some in power have used disinformation to manipulate our differences and pull Americans apart, pressuring us to see our fellow Americans as enemies. The dangers facing our democracy took years to metastasize, and they will take years of sustained, focused effort to effectively reverse. There are steps that we can take today to fix our politics and better set the stage for repairing our democracy. Many of you know I began my career as a social worker. And in our social work training, our first necessary skill is the ability to listen to others. Listening not to argue or rebut, but listening to understand. I ran for the United States Senate rejecting partisanship, willing to work with anyone to help Arizonans build better and more secure lives. And throughout my time serving Arizona, I have listened to Arizonans expressing diverse views on inflation, economic competitiveness, climate, and social priorities, and the role of the federal government itself. I find myself grateful time and time again to learn from Arizonans who share the same core values, but differ in position on issues and policies. Their similarities and their differences are surely representative of the complexity of Americans nationwide. So I find this question answers itself. Can two Americans of sharp intellect and good faith reach different conclusions to the same question? Yes. Yes, of course they can. It is easy for elected officials to give speeches about what they believe. It is harder to listen and acknowledge that there are a whole lot of Americans with different ideas about what is important in our country and how to solve those problems. And yet, it is important to recognize that disagreements are okay. They're normal. And honest disagreements, matched with a willingness to listen and learn, can help us forge sturdy and enduring solutions. You know, Congress was designed to bring together Americans of diverse views, representing different interests, and as a collective, to find compromise and common ground, to serve our country as a whole. We face serious challenges, and meeting them must start with a willingness to be honest, to listen to one another, to lower the political temperature, and to seek lasting solutions. Some have given up on the goal of easing our divisions and uniting Americans. I have not. I've worked hard to demonstrate in my public service the value of working with unlikely allies to get results, helping others see our common humanity and finding our common ground. And I remain stubbornly optimistic because this is America. We have overcome every challenge we've ever faced. And I am committed to doing my part to avoid toxic political rhetoric, to build bridges, to forge common ground, and to achieve lasting results for Arizona and this country. But we are in desperate need of more. More people who are willing to listen, to seek understanding, to stitch together the fabric of our country that has been ripping around the edges. More people who are willing to put down the sticks sharpened for battle and instead pick up their neighbors to learn why they're angry or upset or left behind. So I call on each of us as Americans, let us be those people. We are but one country. We have but one democracy. We can only survive. We can only keep her if we do so together. Thank you.
The senator from Kentucky.
I rise today to speak against the sanctioning of German and Russian businesses over the transport of natural gas between their countries. Proponents of sanctions say, sanction this, sanction that. The Department of Treasury is currently administering dozens of sanctions programs designed to change the behavior of certain countries. And yet, no one seems to ask the important questions. Do sanctions promote peace and understanding, or do they escalate tension between nations? What behavior has China modified since the U.S. began sanctions? Has Russia changed her behavior? Has Russia given back Crimea? Mr. President, can we have order on the floor, please?
Would you, senators please take their conversations outside of the chamber? The senator from Kentucky.
Sanctions, though lacking in proof of effectiveness, are very popular with both parties. Embargoes, sanctions, Big Brother also garner bipartisan enthusiasm. The U.S. embargo of Cuba has now gone on for more than 60 years without any evidence of a change in regime or even a change in regime's policy. Embargoes are often described, especially by the embargoed country, as an act of war. Many historians say that the U.S.'s embargo of 1807 ultimately led to the War of 1812. President Jefferson's embargo was intended to punish France and England for their aggressions, but instead the embargo crippled American shipping exports. Exports declined by 75%. Some historians also blame the U.S. embargo of Japan for the ensuing war. Roosevelt seized many of Japan's assets, and Japan lost access to much of its international trade and over 80% of its imported oil. Effectively, at least from the perspective of Japan, the embargo was an act of war. Yet enthusiasts for embargoes and sanctions still clamor for more. Sanctionistas point to the international sanctions against Iran as the lever that brought about the Obama-era nuclear agreement with Iran. Perhaps, but an equally valid argument can be made that it was the extension of carrots rather than sticks that brought Iran to the table. Funny how diplomacy seems to require give and take, not just take, take, take. Our interaction with Iran should illuminate today's debate over sanctions on the Nordstream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany. But the shade of mercantilism is dimming the light of experience. Opponents of the pipeline not surprisingly, are largely from states that compete in the sale of natural gas. This is more about protectionism than it is national security. Reports are that the pipeline will cause a significant reduction in U.S. exports of liquid natural gas, hence the keen interest by people representing states that sell natural gas. This is not so much about national security, it's about protectionism. Acknowledging that this debate is only superficially about national security and really more about provincial protectionism helps us better understand the dynamics. History demonstrates that trade and interconnectedness between nations is a barrier to war. Engaging in mutually beneficial commerce, coupled with a potent military deterrence, is the combination that best promises peace. Over the past decade, Congress and presidents have heaped sanctions on Russia and China. When I've asked the State Department officials who come before our committee to reveal what behavioral changes have come about as a result of sanctions, I've often got blank stares. Now, the sanctionistas want to sanction an already completed pipeline. Last year, they said if we put sanctions on, we'll stop them. Well, the Senate and the House overwhelmingly passed sanctions. We got sanctions, and they still completed the pipeline. But what behavior are they now asking Russia to change? What specifically is Russia been asked to do? What Russian action is necessary for these sanctions to end? I've asked the sponsor of this bill, the sanctions that you want to do to Russia, what behavior? What do you want from Russia? The response is they don't want any behavioral changes from Russia. The word-for-word response from the sponsors of this bill is they just want Russia not to ship oil to Germany. It's about trade. It's about trade that might compete with certain natural gas-producing states. It has nothing to do with national security. If Nordstream 2 sanctions were really about changing Russian behavior or deterring aggression in Ukraine, then NATO, including Germany, could threaten sanctions if Russia invades Ukraine. Now the threat of sanctions with Germany as an ally might actually have deterring value. In fact, last summer, the U.S. and Germany did just that. The U.S. and Germany announced an agreement in which they said jointly that any attempt to use energy as a weapon or commit further aggressive acts against Ukraine will be met with sanctions. This is Germany and the U.S. together. That has power. Our little pinprick sanctions saying we don't like you and we're going to punish the companies that are involved will do nothing. If we actually worked with Germany, we have deterring value. Germany could turn off the spigot to the natural gas like that. If it's a valid threat from Germany with us together, we might be able to deter Russia. But simply turning the gas pipeline off now and sanctioning it is like being a hostage taker and saying, we don't want you to do this and we have your hostage, and then going ahead and shooting the hostage before you get what you want. We should threaten sanctions. The threat of sanctions has power. Once you turn them on and you have no plan to turn them off, you have no leverage over Russia and you do nothing. The commitment or the agreement between between Germany and the U.S. from the agreement says the commitment is designed to ensure Russia will not misuse any pipeline, including Nordstream 2, to achieve aggressive political ends, or they will be met with sanctions. This could be a deterrence. The more countries that got together and said this, international community of sanctions can have some effect. One country's sanctions, particularly against its ally, Germany, will have no effect. The rush to impose sanctions now undermines the threat of sanctions to deter Russian aggression against Ukraine. You put the sanctions on now and you offer them nothing and no way to remove the sanctions, how are you deterring anything? In fact, you might well make them angry enough that they actually do act in response to the sanctions in the opposite of what you've intended. As today's debate unfolds, I think you'll find that sanctions against Nord Stream 2 are more about mercantilism and protectionism than national security. Thank you.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, first I'd like to ask unanimous consent that I be able to speak for up to 5 minutes, followed by Senator Sullivan, who's on the floor, for up to 15 minutes, and then for Senator Sass for up to 7 minutes before the scheduled recess.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would hope that everyone in this body has listened to Senator Sinema's important speech on the filibuster just now. I really appreciated her clear-eyed rationale, her rationale to preserve the minority voices in this body and to find common ground in this chamber. And I thank her, Mr. President. Mr. President, I also come to the floor today to support the sanctions on Vladimir Putin's Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, I urge all of my colleagues to vote in support of S. 3436, the Protecting Europe's Energy Security Implementation Act. You know, last week, the President of the Ukraine and the Prime Minister of the Ukraine endorsed this legislation. The Prime Minister said the following. He said, Nord Stream 2 is no less an existential threat to our security and democracy than Russian troops on our border. He said, senators shouldn't vote to protect Russia and Nord Stream 2. He said, this is a security matter not only for Ukraine, but for the entire region. I believe the Prime Minister of Ukraine is exactly right. The Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline is being built by Gazprom. For people that aren't familiar with that, Gazprom is the Russian state-owned natural gas company. Now, the pipeline would double the amount of Russian gas going to Germany via the Baltic Sea. This pipeline is an existential threat to our ally, Ukraine. It's a threat to our allies in Europe as well. Right now, Vladimir Putin has mobilized 100,000 troops on the border of Ukraine. Now, he can afford to do this because he is flush with cash. Rising energy prices and reduced American production mean Vladimir Putin has hit the energy economic jackpot. The world is now more dependent on Russian oil and energy. If gas starts to flow through this pipeline, Vladimir Putin will get even richer, more powerful, and the world will become even more dependent on him, the dictator. Vladimir Putin uses energy as a geopolitical weapon. He uses energy to coerce our allies and our partners in Europe. Stopping this pipeline should be an area of bipartisan agreement. In fact, Mr. President, it was an area of bipartisan agreement in this very body until Joe Biden became president. Many Democrats in this body voted for sanctions the first time around. Even Joe Biden opposed the pipeline before he became president. Congress has overwhelmingly passed several pieces of bipartisan legislation imposing sanction on this Russian pipeline. Yet the Biden administration refuses to implement these laws. The Biden administration has now been actively lobbying this body and actively lobbying Congress against this bill. Democrats must think it would give Putin what he wants. I don't get it. They think if you give Putin what he wants, then he's going to play nice. That's not going to happen. Every American president must negotiate from a standpoint and a position of American strength. Vladimir Putin is cunning, opportunistic, and aggressive. He respects strength, not statements. When he sees an opportunity, he takes it. He can smell the weakness. The pipeline will mean an enormous transfer of wealth from our allies to our enemy. It'll make our allies weaker, and it will make Putin stronger. Putin gets stronger, we know he will get even more aggressive. It's time now, Mr. President, for this body to stand up against Russia. It is time to sanction this pipeline. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President. The senator from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I want to commend my colleague from Wyoming, Senator Barrasso, who's been a leader on so many of these issues, and Senator Cruz on his bill, this important piece of legislation that we're going to be voting on here in a couple hours. And, Mr. President, this Nordstream 2 sanctions bill is not just about the immediate crisis in Ukraine, but this would be a continuation of long-term bipartisan American strategy as it deals with Russia, energy security, and American security. So I want to provide a little broader context to that bipartisan strategy, Mr. President, and put this debate and vote that we're having here today into that context. The United States' commitment to European security, as we all know, is ironclad. We fought 2 world wars, a Cold War, to protect our interests in a free and open Europe. We expanded NATO to secure those gains and to prevent Russia from ever building a new empire that could threaten us or our allies. But, Mr. President, as we all know, Russian power is not just a function of military power. To the contrary, Vladimir Putin and the Russians for decades have been using energy in terms of power and energy as a weapon. As a matter of fact, it's their weapon of choice in many instances in Europe. Let me provide a few recent examples. If you look at this map, one pipeline that's actually not depicted is the so-called Brotherhood pipeline from Russia into Ukraine, and it goes into Europe. The Russians have cut off supplies of natural gas on that and other pipelines going through Ukraine in 2006, in 2008, in 2014, and in 2015. In Moldova, shortly after the defeat of a pro-Russian government in the election of a pro-Western one, Russia did what they normally do. They cut off gas to that country. And, Mr. President, it's not just impacting countries like Ukraine. When these gas supplies were cut off by Russia because Vladimir Putin was angry about something, it impacted over 18 EU countries with regard to those cutoffs. And it's happening even today. Just yesterday, Mr. President, the head of the International Energy Agency in Paris said that Russia is already, right now, strategically limiting natural gas to Europe during this very cold winter to pressure European nations not to support Ukraine as the Russians amass tens of thousands of troops on their border as we speak. For these reasons, Mr. President, it has been the long-standing bipartisan American policy to do 2 things as it relates to energy security. First, we have sought, dating back to the 1980s, to block implementation of major pipelines from Russia, from then the Soviet Union, into Europe. The Reagan administration did this with sanctions in 1982, and we have continued to work this element of our policy. The other element of American bipartisan policy as it relates to European energy security has been to help countries, former Soviet Union countries, particularly in the Caspian and Central Asia area, to provide their own energy outlets in terms of natural gas and oil to Europe through the Southern Corridor, the BTC pipeline. These are all areas that Democrats and Republicans have been involved with in terms of energy supplies to our European allies that don't go through Russia. Mr. President, some of the diplomacy here on these pipelines started with the Clinton administration, who did a very good job on this. I had the opportunity as an Assistant Secretary of State in charge of economic and energy issues in the Bush administration to lead efforts on these Southern Corridor pipelines, and they were successful. Right now, these pipelines are providing energy to our allies in Europe. They don't go through Russia. They start in countries like Azerbaijan, go through Georgia, go through Turkey. This has been very bipartisan, supported by the Senate. And the Russians hate this. They hate it. Why? Because it doesn't give them any control over energy into Europe. So, Mr. President, as I mentioned, today's vote is actually part of a long-term, bipartisan American strategy for decades that we have been pursuing because we know the Russians use energy, particularly natural gas, as a weapon. So how have we been doing on this? Well, at the end of the Trump administration, we were in a very good position on European energy security in two key areas. First, as Senator Barrasso mentioned, we had strong, very strong bipartisan support with regard to Nordstream 2 sanctions on its construction and operations. We had overwhelming Republican and Democrat support for the sanctions that we're going to be voting on today in the 2021 NDAA and in the 2020 NDAA. Very big, very bipartisan. Another reason we were set up very well, Mr. President, in terms of Eurasian energy security, is at the end of the Trump administration, we had achieved a long-standing bipartisan goal of American national security, economic security, and energy security. What was that? Energy independence. We once again had become the world's energy superpower. What do I mean by that? Largest producer of oil, bigger than Saudi Arabia. Largest producer of natural gas, bigger than Russia. One of the biggest producers of renewables in the world. This is a bipartisan goal. With regard to European security, why was that so important? Because it answered a huge question that the Europeans often said. If we're going to block Nord Stream 2, Russian gas into Germany and other places in Europe, where are we going to get the gas? Well, we had an answer. We're going to get the gas from America. Our exports of LNG, liquefied natural gas, surged to Asia and Europe to take care of this problem. This is a good thing. And Mr. President, in terms of the environment and climate, U.S. LNG exports to Europe have a 41% lower emissions profile than Russian gas and pipelines to Europe. So it's good for the environment, climate, national security, energy security. And here's another area. This big production of American energy was something that the people who know Vladimir Putin best knew that it was one of the biggest things we could do. A couple years ago, I was in a meeting with my colleague, who we miss very much here, Senator McCain, and a Russian dissident, a very famous Russian dissident. And at the end of the meeting, I said, what more can we do to undermine the Putin regime? And Mr. President, you know what he said to me? He looked me in the eye without hesitating, saying, produce more American energy. That's the number one thing you can do to undermine the Putin regime. And we did it. We did it. So these were all things, in addition to strengthening our own military, in addition to giving the Ukrainians Javelin missile systems, all of these things were putting us in a good position. Putin seemed very much in a box and certainly wasn't threatening Ukraine with tens of thousands of troops on the border. Where are we today on these key areas that I just mentioned? Well, Mr. President, we're not in such good shape. In terms of energy independence, this administration seems focused on actually destroying the production of American energy, oil and gas in particular. I guarantee you the dictators in Moscow, as well as in Beijing, can hardly believe their luck. Seems like President Putin wants to undermine the very bipartisan goals we've had for decades, American energy independence, in the United States as the world's energy superpower again. I mean, just think about what he's seeing. Cancels pipelines, the Keystone Pipeline, Canada, the United States, and the president is greenlighting Nordstream 2, killing energy production like in great states like mine. Just Monday, there was more obstacles to produce energy in Alaska, and now we're importing 2 times as much oil from Russia as we were a year ago. That's helping Putin, hurting the United States. And Mr. President, what about Nord Stream 2, where we look so strong just in the past few years? With this body, in a strong bipartisan way, sanctioning that pipeline right there. Well, President Biden has green-lighted it. But we don't have to. That's the point of this vote today. And again, this vote is not just about the current crisis in Ukraine. It's about countering a long-term, it's about continuing a long-term bipartisan approach to Eurasian energy security that would make our European allies less vulnerable to Russian energy blackmail, which has not only gone back decades, it's literally happening right now. Just listen, as I mentioned, to the International Energy Agency's report yesterday on this topic. And, Mr. President, to be honest, it's also about a more political question, this vote today. Many of my Democratic colleagues suddenly became very hawkish against Russia and Putin on these issues and other issues during the Trump years. And I welcome their conversion to a more hardline approach. But it always begged the question, was that more hawkish conversion a principled one? Because they realized being tough on Putin in terms of energy and our military was the best way to achieve American national interests? Or was this conversion more of a temporary one, depending on who occupied the White House? I hope it's not the latter, but today's vote will answer that for some of the senators who are looking to change their recent votes. But clearly, some of my colleagues just a few years ago who were voting to sanction and stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and were sounding very tough on Vladimir Putin and Russia are now in a bit of a quandary if they vote differently today. So not surprisingly, they're making arguments to rationalize this new position, and I'd like to review briefly, Mr. President, just a few of those. Senator Murphy's been down on the floor, the junior senator from Connecticut, with a lot of these arguments. And I respect him, thoughtful voice on foreign policy. I don't always agree with him, but he's a serious voice. But, Mr. President, his arguments on this issue right now are not very persuasive or powerful. Here's the thing he's saying right now. This isn't about Russia. Now I'm quoting Senator Murphy. This is about, quote, a Cruz-Trump agenda to break up the Atlantic alliance. Cruz-Trump agenda to break up the Atlantic alliance. Now look, he's clearly trying to make a boogeyman here, the so-called Cruz-Trump agenda. But, Mr. President, serious people who have been working on these issues for decades know that what we're doing today is a continuation of long-term bipartisan support for really important energy security policy for the United States and our European allies. This is continuing that long-standing approach. You know, in his quote on the Cruz-Trump agenda, he said this is actually about keeping the Atlantic relationship going to, quote, save Ukraine from an invasion. Save Ukraine from an invasion. But where's the president of Ukraine on this issue? What does the president of Ukraine, who knows a little bit about power politics and Putin, think about what we're doing here today? He supports sanctions. He supports sanctions on Nord Stream 2. That's where Senator Murphy's starting to dig a little deeper on his weak arguments and trying to provide cover for his colleagues who are going to change their vote. He had to respond on where President Zelensky of Ukraine was. Here's what Senator Murphy said about that. I'm a big supporter of President Zelensky, but he often misreads American politics, and I think it would be better for him to have stayed out of this one. Wow. Wow, so the leader of the country, right here, who many of us think this is all about, who certainly knows what Russian energy power politics are about, since he's been on the pointy end of that weapon many times, we now have a senator saying, President Zelensky, sit down, be quiet, stay out of this one. We don't want to hear from you, even though this is about, quote, saving your country, unless, of course, you support his position on Nord Stream 2. So, Mr. President, these are very weak arguments by the senator from Connecticut. The most legitimate argument I've heard some of my Democratic friends make on switching their vote on their previous Nord Stream 2 sanctions is that the Germans, a very important ally, we all agree on that, don't want us to apply Nord Stream 2 sanctions. Okay, that's an argument we should all consider. And this is what I've heard Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan have been telling senators this week as they lobby against this vote we're going to take. Although early in the year it was reported in the press that both of them actually supported Nord Stream 2 sanctions. But, Mr. President, here's the thing on that argument. It's actually hard to tell what the Germans really want. In fact, what the Germans really want seems to be changing by the hour. There was a recent change in government in Germany, and the new foreign minister herself has said that the country should not grant Nord Stream 2 regulatory approval in order to resist, quote, Russian blackmail on energy prices. This is the current foreign minister of Germany. And it's also important to remember where the rest of the European Union is. There is broad opposition in Europe on Nord Stream 2. The European Parliament voted last year on an overwhelming cross-party basis, 581 to 50, in favor of canceling the entire project in the wake of the arrest of Alexei Navalny, a Russian democracy leader who Putin first tried to kill before locking away in prison. The European Parliament has voted at least 4 further times in other resolutions to call on the EU to halt this very project, which is what we're looking to vote on today. And finally, Mr. President, outsourcing this very important foreign policy, national security, American issue to the Germans is simply not wise. The Germans have not always been so clean or level-headed when it comes to Russian gas, Gazprom, and Nord Stream 2. What am I talking about? Well, of course, I'm talking about the former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schroeder, one of the biggest betrayers of the West, certainly in this and last century. He left his chancellorship to become Putin's Gazprom lapdog. He's the main lobbyist pushing Russian gas all over Germany and Europe. He's an embarrassment to the Atlantic Alliance. Now as the chairman for many years of Gazprom, the former chancellor of Germany. And of course he's influenced Germans to say this is good. He's made millions doing it, by the way. Should be sanctioned with other Putin cronies. But so at the end of the day, Mr. President, this shouldn't be outsourced to Germany. What we need to do is make a vote on what's right for American national security. And a vote that sanctions this pipeline would be consistent with long-term, very bipartisan American, Eurasian energy security policy. Make no mistake, my colleagues, Nord Stream 2 is Putin's pipeline. Let's not make it his lifeline. I encourage all of my colleagues to do what they've done recently in the last couple years, which is vote in an overwhelming, bipartisan manner to sanction the Nordstream 2 pipeline. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to commend the senior senator from Arizona for an extraordinary stand of courage and just a great speech on the floor a few minutes ago. Mr. President, I rise today to defend the filibuster again from the latest round of attacks. I did this repeatedly in the last administration, earning the ire and frustration of a president of my own party over and over again as I defended the Senate's purpose and the supermajority requirements that forge a consensus in a big, broad, diverse continental nation. Today, I rise to defend the filibuster again when it's a president of the other party who's decided to go full demagogue. For his entire career in the Senate, basically, Joe Biden served in this body as long as I've been alive, plus or minus a few years. Joe Biden was a stalwart defender of the filibuster. He said that weakening the filibuster would, quote, eviscerate the Senate. But earlier this week, the president was pushed around by a bunch of rage-addicted 20-somethings on his staff and agreed to go down to Georgia and just read whatever nonsense they loaded into his teleprompter. It was shameful. It was sad. The president of the United States called half of the country a bunch of racist bigots. Think about that. Half the country, a bunch of racist bigots. He doesn't believe that. This was a senile comment of a man who read whatever was loaded into his teleprompter. His speechwriters puppet mastered him into saying that anyone who disagrees with him is George Wallace, Bull Connor, Jefferson Davis. You disagree with Joe Biden, and you're Jefferson Davis. It's pretty breathtaking. Equating millions of Americans to some of the ugliest racists in all of American history, that isn't just overheated rhetoric, it's a disgusting smear. Does President Biden really believe this in his heart of hearts? Based on the conversations I've had with him over the years, I don't think he believes this at all. So let's go back to last year. Candidate Joe Biden ran for office promising that he would